Hello, everyone. This is lesson 25, lecture 2, where we are continuing the story of Octavian becoming Augustus. So now to continue this discussion, let us look at a section of Beard's book where she talks about this transformation herself and sort of gives us a good sense of what exactly is changing as Octavian becomes Augustus. So here we are in the process of taking and holding power. Augustus also transformed himself in a staggering shift from brutal warlord and insurgent to responsible elder statesman, signaled by his astute change of name, right? So I believe Beard translates the revered one for Augustus. So that's a shift from the brutal warlord and insurgent to responsible elder statesman. His early record as Octavian was a mixture of sadism, scandal, and illegality. He fought his way into Roman politics in 44 BCE using a private army and tactics that were no far short of a coup. He went on to be jointly responsible for a ghastly program on the model of Sulla's proscriptions, and if Roman tradition is to be believed, to have plenty of blood literally on his hands. How he left all this behind to become the founding father of a new regime, and in the eyes of many, the model emperor and the benchmark against which his successors were often judged, was a question that many observant Romans came to ask. How did he do it? So that is the question for us, because in a way, this is the same question that Caesar had to ask himself, sort of how do you settle down from a period of civil war? How are you able to um, essentially pacify people? It's very hard to teach someone who has gotten used to using weapons to get what they want not to do so. And I think that our answer in this class, will have something to do with what you might call propaganda, but you can most certainly call representation. And Augustus is a master of representing himself. And this is why, in fact, again, his monument on his deeds is so important, because it gives us a sense of how he is able to manage his power in a way that it becomes less offensive to people. So now, if you look at the handout, look at the very first words of De Res Gestae, a copy of the Deeds of the Divine Augustus. This sort of indicates that sort of this was meant to be, by the phrase Divine Augustus, a posthumous document. So this is something he wrote in his lifetime, but the intention was to publish it upon his death. And I think that in that moment, Augustus is very aware of a dynamic, which is that in his lifetime, even though he might get praise from people who are afraid of him, but maybe behind his back, people might say things, that it's really very important also to shape people's opinions past your lifetime in terms of how your regime will be evaluated for a long time to come. And in fact, the master copy of this document was displayed on Augustus's tomb, a mausoleum in the city of Rome. But if you look at this first paragraph on the handout, so below is a copy of the Deeds of the Divine Augustus, by which he subjected the whole world to the dominion of the Roman people, and of the sums of money he spent upon the Republic and the Roman people, even as they are graven on the two brazen columns which are set up in Rome. One thing here that's very powerful is that in suggesting that this is a dominion of the Roman people over the whole world that he is leading. So he's really envisioning himself on the top of this, top of the whole world. So one thing that we can start observing in the following paragraph, and I put this on the slide to really emphasize what we have in mind, that we have to watch the language very, very carefully to understand how this text works. And so if you look at this first sentence after the introduction, he begins in the year 44 BCE, so in my 20th year, which means he was 19, going on to become 20 soon. Acting on my own initiative and at my own charges, I raised an army wherewith I brought again liberty to the Republic, oppressed by the dominance of a faction. And I think what's super interesting here, you might recall that Julius Caesar, in his commentary on his conquest in Gaul, used a third person to appear objective, sort of that was his strategy to try to make it look like, objectively, I am just an awesome commander. In contrast, Augustus will use first person, right? He will say, I did all of this. And I think it's just sort of the first bit to observe this sort of somewhat shameless claim to power. But what he also does in the very same sentence is that he says, I brought again liberty to the republic that was oppressed. So this is quite interesting to suggest, because if you were to write a history that was an anti-Augustan history of this period, you would probably call him a tyrant. But he claims that he is the one who brings back liberty to the republic. So I think what we see here is this self-representation that's so critical to the success of Augustus, is that he will be able to push through a representation of himself as really excellent. Now, how this might work, we can also get a good sense of if we keep reading this text. So you will need to turn to the other side of the handout and go to the very end of this text, which is where he left sort of the political piece, sort of what is meant by this liberty. So this is what he says again on the very end of the handout. In my 6th and 7th consulship, so this is 28 and 27 BCE, when I had put an end to the civil wars, after having obtained complete control of the government, by universal consent, I transferred the republic from my own dominion back to the authority of the Senate and the Roman people. In return for this favor by me, I received by decree of the Senate the title Augustus. And then he concludes, after that time I excelled all others in dignity, but of power I had no more than those who were my colleagues in any magistracy. And so one of the words that's often used to describe Roman emperors is a word that they used for himself. This is a word we have encountered a few times, principate. So princeps or princeps, both pronunciations are fine, means the first, right? It's our word prince essentially comes from the same concept. It means someone is the first. And essentially the political claim that Augustus makes in this passage is that he is first, but he's first among equals. He's sort of the leader of the troop, but he doesn't think that he has more power. Now, this is not factually true, but it's a very good way to represent his power if he is trying to make sure that he's not going to get killed for being essentially a king in Rome, a tyrant, somebody who has too much individual power. And so one other thing that we might also notice in this passage is that he does say that essentially he followed consent, universal consent. So everybody wanted this, that he would return the republic to the Senate and the people of Rome. And so he followed that universal consent. So it also suggests that in fact, the power arrangement that currently exists in Rome is one that was created by consent, by the consent of everybody, or at least members of the elite. And again suggests sort of that everybody is in this together with him, or at least they agreed for him to have this role. And I think that the last bit that's interesting is that I think we don't need to read this very carefully to notice is that there is a lot of I's, right? Over 90 times in the text, he says something about I or mine, or, something about the first person. And I think that what's interesting is that he is the agent in this text. It's always him. It's I put an end to the civil wars. I transferred the republic. So he asks other for consent, but he is the one who is doing the action. And I think even though we could emphasize the consent, we can also say that a lot goes into the action. A lot goes into him sort of doing all these things. And that in fact, as much as the emphasis might be on consent, it's also scary to see him quite so powerful. It's up to him. He could have not transferred the republic. He could not have put an end to the civil wars. Another aspect of this representation is that sometimes we can really feel that this is a sort of biased text, or something that maybe is a twist on the truth. And this is can be very clear from another passage that's actually on the top of the same side of the sheet. So the top of the second page of the handout, when he talks about the revenge for Caesar's murder. And I think that the reason this is so critical is that in ancient Rome, if you don't take revenge for the murder of your father, you are not considered a legitimate heir, right? Usually fathers are not murdered, but if they are murdered and you are their heir, then that's sort of a stain on your family line that you have to do something about. So this is what Augustus has to say about what happened after Caesar's murder. Remember, this was the Ides of March 44 BCE. So he says, the men who killed my father, I drove into exile by strictly judicial process. Now, I think this is sort of very tricky by itself, because, it's true that the second triumvirate was legal. So, the job that he got to take revenge for Caesar's death was a legal arrangement. But that was after Augustus, then still as Octavian, marched on Rome with soldiers, so the strictly judicial process was sort of, before it happened, was preceded by a rather violent military action. And then he continues, and then when they took up arms against the Republic, and notice what just happened, he says, they are against the Republic, I am for the Republic, right? So they are the enemy of the state, not me. Twice I overcame them in battle. So these would be the battles in October at Philippi. Now, I don't know how much you recall from the previous lecture, but it's very far from the truth that Augustus was so successful in these battles. In fact, in both cases, Antony was a much better commander and was much more responsible for the victory. So we see how, if you read the Res Gestae carefully, it's easy to end up with a narrative that sounds like, I, Augustus, 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 I am amazing and I did everything. But it's very clear to us, based on the available evidence, we do have some other sources, that this was one version of the story that Augustus was, however, very intent on selling to the Roman people. This is the end of lecture 2. And in lecture 3, we are going to continue with a discussion of how all this sort of fighting and conflict fits into Augustus's self-representation.